The morning Sylvia Okonkwo signed the divorce papers, the sky over Ottawa was the color of old dishwater, flat, gray and completely indifferent. She didn't cry. She had done all her crying in November, alone in the car outside a Sobeys parking lot on Merivale Road, engine running, heat on full, hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. That was 3 months ago. By the time February came and the courthouse date arrived, there was nothing left to cry out of her. She wore her navy coat, the good one, cashmere, double-breasted, bought with her own money before she'd ever met Marcus Hale. She wore it because it made her stand straight, because some mornings you dress for the person you're trying to become, not the one you still feel like. Her lawyer, Patricia Nwosu, sat beside her at the long table. Marcus sat across next to his own lawyer, and beside him, though she hadn't been invited, though no one had asked her to come, sat Jessica Tran, 29 years old, worked in Marcus's office on Albert Street. Sylvia had met her at the company Christmas party 2 years in a row and thought she seemed perfectly nice. That was the part that still sat wrong even now, not the betrayal itself, the ordinariness of it. The clerk collected the documents and passed copies around the table. The pen scratched across paper. Marcus didn't look up. Jess, to her credit, had stayed out in the hallway. Sylvia only saw her through the narrow rectangle of glass in the door, arms crossed, staring at her phone. Patricia touched Sylvia's elbow when it was done. Outside, the cold hit immediately. Sylvia pulled her coat tighter and walked to the top of the courthouse steps. She could hear Marcus behind her talking to his lawyer in a low voice, something about the condo. She didn't turn around. A black car idled at the bottom of the steps, long, quiet, immaculate. The driver, a man in a dark jacket, stepped out and opened the rear door without being asked, as if he'd been watching for exactly her. Sylvia walked down the steps. She didn't hurry, she didn't look back. The door closed behind her with a soft, expensive sound, and the car pulled away from the curb. She heard Marcus say her name once. She did not answer. She had met Marcus Hale at a fundraiser for the Ottawa Hospital Foundation 7 years ago. She was 31, newly promoted to senior project manager at Caldwell Infrastructure, a mid-sized civil engineering firm that did mostly public contracts across Ontario and Quebec. He was charming in the way that men who have recently discovered they're attractive can be charming. Slightly too aware of it, but still genuinely warm underneath. He laughed easily. He remembered things people told him. He made Sylvia feel, for the first time in a long time, like someone worth remembering. They dated for a year and a half. They married at a small ceremony on Prince Edward Island. Her grandmothers on both sides had insisted on a church, so they found one overlooking the Red Cliffs. Her grandmother Dorothy, 83 years old and sharp as a tack, had pulled Sylvia aside the morning of the wedding. "You love him?" Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Sylvia said. Dorothy nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was turning something over. "Just make sure you stay yours while you're his, that's all I'm saying." Sylvia had kissed her cheek and thought she understood what that meant. She didn't, not fully, until much later. The first years were good. They were genuinely good. They bought a semi-detached in Westboro. They cooked elaborate Sunday dinners. They drove to Gatineau Park in October and walked through the leaves like they had all the time in the world. Marcus's consulting firm, Hale Strategy Group, was growing steadily. Sylvia was pulling 60-hour weeks on a major transit infrastructure bid. They were tired and busy and deeply familiar with each other in the way that happy couples become, comfortable in a way she mistook for permanence. She didn't see it coming. That's the sentence she turned over endlessly afterward, the one she couldn't quite make peace with. She was supposed to be observant. She noticed things, load tolerances, drainage patterns, the gap between what a contractor promised and what he delivered. She caught problems before they became disasters. It was what she was good at. She had not caught this. The signs, once she looked for them, were the usual ones. Marcus started staying later at the office. He began showering as soon as he got home, before dinner, which he'd never done before. He was on his phone constantly, and when she walked into a room he'd tilt the screen away, almost imperceptibly, the way you'd shield cards in a poker game. He became simultaneously more attentive, bringing her coffee in the morning, suggesting weekend trips, and somehow less present, like he was compensating for something, like he felt guilty enough to try harder, but not guilty enough to stop. In early November, Sylvia came home early from a site visit in Kingston. She'd caught a stomach bug on the drive back, stopped twice on the highway, and arrived home at 4 in the afternoon when Marcus thought she'd be gone until evening. She heard his voice in the kitchen. She heard him laughing. When she walked in, he ended the call. "Who was that?" she asked. "Client," he said. He didn't miss a beat. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, and in that silence something shifted. Not broke, not yet, but shifted like a wall developing a crack that isn't visible from the outside but that the whole structure can feel. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed. And she made a decision, not in anger, not even in grief exactly, but in the cold, methodical way she approached every project that mattered. She was going to find out the truth, and she was going to be ready for whatever came after it. The private investigator's name was Howard Bell. He'd been recommended by Patricia Nwosu, who Sylvia had quietly called 3 days after the kitchen incident. Not to talk divorce, she told herself, just to understand her situation, just to know her options. Patricia had given her Howard's card without fanfare, and Howard had turned out to be a compact, unhurried man in his 50s, who worked out of a small office on Bank Street, and had the demeanor of someone who had heard everything, and was surprised by nothing. "I need documentation," Sylvia told him at their first meeting. "If I'm wrong, I want to know that. If I'm right, I need it to hold up." Howard had nodded and said he'd be in touch. He was in touch within 2 weeks. She remembered sitting in her car in the Caldwell Infrastructure parking garage and reading his message, then calling him back immediately. The evidence was what she'd expected and still somehow worse to hear confirmed. 7 months. A hotel near Kanata twice a month, always on evenings when Marcus claimed client dinners. A coffee shop on Wellington Street on Tuesday mornings. Marcus told Sylvia those were early strategy sessions with a junior partner. Receipts, photographs taken from a public space. Nothing illegal, nothing salacious in how Howard described it, just the plain and comprehensive evidence of a life being conducted in 2 registers at once. She sat in that parking garage for 22 minutes. Then she wiped her face, went back upstairs to her desk, and finished the cost-benefit analysis for the Barhaven interchange she'd been working on all week. She was not going to let this make her sloppy. Over the following weeks, she began preparing. Not in secret, she wasn't deceitful by nature, but quietly, systematically, in the way she'd always approached complex problems. She called Patricia Nwosu and scheduled a formal consultation. She assembled her financial records, her salary, her retirement accounts, the property documents, the joint credit accounts, her own investment portfolio that she'd been quietly building since before they were married. She documented everything Marcus had charged to their shared visa in the previous 12 months, 2 hotel stays that appeared as miscellaneous accommodation, a bracelet from a jeweler on Spark Street that she had never received, 4 restaurant bills from places she had never been to. She didn't confront Marcus. Not yet. Patricia had advised her not to, and even without that advice, Sylvia understood intuitively that confrontation at the wrong moment would only scatter the pieces she was still collecting. Instead, she did something she'd been putting off for 2 years. She called her accountant, a meticulous woman named Ruth Bergeron, who had been her grandmother Dorothy's bookkeeper for 30 years and had transitioned to Sylvia when Dorothy retired. Sylvia had always liked Ruth's combination of precision and bluntness. "I want to restructure my portfolio," Sylvia told her. "And I need to talk to you about a few property opportunities I've been looking at." She had, in fact, been looking at properties for months. A habit she'd developed after a colleague at Caldwell had mentioned a small commercial development in Stittsville that had tripled in value in 4 years. Sylvia understood development timelines better than most people. She understood what infrastructure investment did to property values around it. She had not acted on any of this yet, partly out of inertia, partly because Marcus had always responded to her investment ideas with a vague enthusiasm that never quite crystallized into support. Now she didn't need his support. She and Ruth spent 3 meetings reviewing Sylvia's independent assets, the savings account she'd maintained separately throughout the marriage, her TFSA and RRSP accounts, the $15,000 her grandmother Dorothy had given her on her 35th birthday with the instructions to do something real with it. The total picture was better than Sylvia had let herself believe. When you spent 5 years deferring your own plans, it was easy to forget what you'd already built. She made her first purchase in January, 6 weeks before the divorce was finalized, a mixed-use property on Richmond Road, ground floor commercial, 2 residential units above. The numbers were straightforward. The location was exactly the kind of street that benefited from the transit corridor Caldwell was currently bidding to expand. She put it in her name alone, through a numbered company Ruth had helped her set up, Okonkwo Property Group Inc. The name felt right. Dorothy's maiden name had been Okonkwo, and Sylvia had always used it as her professional middle name. Sylvia O'Hale on most documents, though she'd already spoken to Patricia about reverting to Sylvia Okonkwo entirely. She told no one except Ruth and Patricia, not her sister in Vancouver, not her best friend Meg, who would have meant well but was constitutionally incapable of keeping a secret for more than a week. She just worked. She had always been good at working. Marcus asked for a meeting in December to talk about everything. He chose the kitchen table, which Sylvia found faintly absurd. As if the room where she'd cooked him dinner for 6 years was now neutral territory. He sat across from her with his hands folded and told her he was sorry. He said it twice. He said Jess hadn't meant for any of this to happen, which was such a remarkable sentence that Sylvia let it sit in the air between them for a full 5 seconds before she responded. "I'm not here to talk about Jess," she said. "I'm here to talk about the divorce. Patricia has sent your lawyer the preliminary terms. I'd like this to be clean." Marcus looked as if he'd expected something different from her. Tears perhaps, recrimination, something that matched the scale of what he'd done. He seemed almost unsettled by her composure, which she noted with a quiet private satisfaction. "You seem," he started. "I'm fine," she said. "I'd like us both to be fine, which is why I want this settled quickly." He nodded. He said okay. He said she'd always been the more practical one. She let that sit too. The terms were in fact straightforward. They had no children. They'd kept many of their finances separate. The house in Westboro they had agreed to sell. Patricia had negotiated cleanly, and the listing was scheduled for March. The joint accounts were being separated. The visa charges that Howard Bell had documented were part of what Patricia had quietly used to ensure the settlement was equitable. Marcus had agreed to everything within a week. That surprised Sylvia slightly, until Patricia explained that Marcus's lawyer had almost certainly advised him that contesting would be more costly, given what they'd documented. "He knows you have the receipts," Patricia said. Sylvia had almost smiled at that. The night before the courthouse date, Sylvia drove to Dorothy's house in Nepean. Her grandmother was in the kitchen when she arrived, which was where Dorothy always was at 7 in the evening, seated at the table with a cup of tea and whatever mystery novel she was currently working through. She was 89 now and slightly slower on her feet, but her mind was as precise as a measuring instrument. "Sit down," Dorothy said without looking up from her page. "Tea's still hot." Sylvia sat. She poured her own cup. Outside the window, the Ottawa River Valley was dark and still, a line of distant lights through the pine trees. "Tomorrow," Dorothy said. "Tomorrow," Sylvia confirmed. Dorothy turned a page. She read for another minute, then set the book face down on the table and looked at her granddaughter in the direct, unhurried way she had always looked at things she was taking seriously. "You're going to be all right," Dorothy said. "I know," Sylvia said. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you." Dorothy wrapped both hands around her mug. "I've been watching you since November. You've been quiet, which isn't the same as sad. You've been moving, which matters more than feeling ready." She paused. "I told you on your wedding day. Stay yours." "I know," Sylvia said again, and this time the words sat differently. Dorothy nodded once. "Then you already know how this ends." They sat together until nearly 10 o'clock, not talking much, the kitchen warm and unhurried. When Sylvia finally got up to leave, Dorothy stood, slowly, with one hand on the table, and hugged her for longer than usual. "The property on Richmond Road," Dorothy said as Sylvia was putting her coat on. Sylvia stopped. "How did you know about that?" Dorothy gave her a look. "Ruth has worked for this family for 32 years. Sylvia started to laugh. "It's a good street," Dorothy said. "Your grandfather always said so." The courthouse was cold and bureaucratic and smelled like recycled air. Marcus arrived 3 minutes after Sylvia. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well, which she registered without feeling anything in particular about. His lawyer was a man named something she'd already forgotten, efficient and brisk. Patricia sat beside Sylvia and was quietly, professionally formidable. It took less than 40 minutes. On the way out, Marcus fell into step beside her in the hallway. She could hear him drawing breath as if he was going to say something, and she kept walking. Her heels on the marble floor were unhurried and even. "Sylvia," he said. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the February cold. She did not turn around. The car at the bottom of the courthouse steps belonged to Lawrence Adeyemi. She had met Lawrence 8 months ago at a real estate investment panel at the Ottawa Carleton Board of Trade. He was 54, Nigerian-Canadian, and one of the most quietly formidable people she had encountered in a professional context. A man who had built an entire portfolio of commercial and mixed-use properties across Ontario from a starting position of nothing except precision and patience. He spoke at the panel for 20 minutes, and Sylvia, who had arrived fully intending to network aggressively with the 3 developers she'd already identified, had spent the entire session listening to Lawrence Adeyemi instead and taking notes. They'd spoken afterward. She'd asked him a specific question about cap rates in secondary Ontario markets, and he'd answered it directly, without the vague investor speak she'd grown accustomed to. He'd asked her one question back. What she did? She told him. He said he'd been following the Barhaven corridor bid and had some thoughts. They exchanged cards. What followed was 8 months of intermittent contact, emails, then a coffee meeting, then a longer working session at his firm's office on Elgin Street, where she'd met his 2 business partners and they'd walked through several projects together. Lawrence was developing a mid-scale residential complex in the south end of the city, and needed a project manager who understood infrastructure and construction sequencing at a level that his current team didn't. He had asked Sylvia in November, The same month she'd come home early from Kingston to hear Marcus on the phone. Whether she'd consider consulting for the project. She'd said she would think about it. She'd been thinking about a great many things in November. She had called him back in January and said yes. None of that was romantic. She needed to be plain about that, to herself. Mostly because the version of this story where a woman escapes a bad marriage into a billionaire's arms was not her story, and she had no interest in that story. Lawrence Adeyemi was a professional contact who had become a genuine colleague, and he was sending his car this morning as a professional courtesy, because they had a working lunch scheduled at his offices, and he had seen the courthouse date in their shared calendar and offered without making a fuss about it. "You don't have to do that," she'd told him. "It's a car," he'd said, "and you've got enough to think about today." She'd accepted because that was the kind of practical, undemonstrative kindness she'd stopped turning down. She got into the car. The door closed. She sat back against the leather seat and watched Ottawa pass by through the tinted window. The Rideau Canal on the left, the bare trees, the gray river of February sky overhead. She felt something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something quieter. Like a pressure she had been living inside for so long she'd stopped feeling it as pressure and now it was simply gone. Her phone buzzed. A text from Meg. "How'd it go? You okay?" She typed back, "Clean, done, going to lunch." "I'm fine, actually fine, I'll call you tonight." She put the phone in her bag. Somewhere behind her she knew. Marcus was standing on those courthouse steps with his lawyer and perhaps Jess, who had presumably come out of the hallway. She didn't know what he was feeling, she didn't need to. The working lunch lasted 3 hours. Lawrence's business partner, a woman named Adaisy, who had the efficient warmth of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste energy on anything that didn't matter, walked Sylvia through the residential complex's current timeline. There were 2 structural issues with the proposed underground parking configuration that Sylvia spotted within the first 15 minutes of reviewing the drawings. "These load assumptions are off," she said, pointing to a column in the specs. Adaisy leaned in. "We thought so." The engineer flagged it and then got cautious. "I can run the corrected calculations this week, and there's a sequencing issue in phase 2 that's going to cost you 3 weeks if you don't catch it now." Lawrence, who had said almost nothing for the past 40 minutes, looked at Sylvia with a quiet expression she couldn't fully read. Satisfaction perhaps, or simply recognition. "I told you," he said to Adaisy. Adaisy glanced at him, then at Sylvia. "He's been saying since November that we needed you on this properly." "I needed to sort a few things out first," Sylvia said. Lawrence nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant without requiring elaboration. After lunch, he walked her out to the lobby. The city beyond the glass was still gray, but lighter now. The particular February light that Ottawa got in the late afternoon when the sky cleared briefly before dark. "The Richmond Road property," Lawrence said. "I heard it's under your company now." She looked at him. "Word travels. The development community in this city is smaller than it appears." He paused. "It's a good acquisition. That street is going to look different in 5 years." "I know," she said. "That's why I bought it." He almost smiled. "I know you know. I'm just saying it out loud." She put on her coat, the navy cashmere, still unwrinkled, still good. She thought briefly of Dorothy's kitchen the night before, the warm light, the cup of tea, the river dark through the pine trees. "Stay yours. I'll send you the corrected calculations by Friday," she said. "I'll be waiting," Lawrence said. She walked out through the glass doors and stood for a moment on the sidewalk on Elgin Street, the cold air sharp and clean in her lungs. She had a lot of work ahead of her: the calculations, the Richmond Road units, which needed a property manager and some cosmetic work before they could lease, the Caldwell bid, which was in its final stage, the Okonkwo Property Group, which was currently 1 building and a numbered company and a very clear vision. She had a lot of work. She had always been good at that. She started walking.